Imagine a student who spends hours perfecting a challenging art project, but then she completely avoids writing a tough research paper. Now, imagine another student who does the exact opposite. Why, right? Why tackle one difficult project but not the other? What drives these choices and what does it reveal about how people interpret difficulty? Hello there, this is Bradley, and you're listening to Psych Everywhere. This episode was made possible by CSPP Alliant International University. If you'd like to learn about graduate programs at CSPP, see the link in the show notes. Today we're exploring the subject of difficulty with Dr. Daphna Oyserman, whose identity-based motivation theory sheds light on why difficulty, it could mean importance or impossibility or even improvement. Dr. Oyserman received a PhD in psychology and social work from the University of Michigan, and she's currently at USC Dornsife. She recently has been invited to be the Psych High Distinguished Lecturer at WPA in Tacoma, so we're really fortunate to have her here with us today on the show. Dr. Oyserman, welcome to Psych Everywhere.
Thank you for having me.
So this conversation gravitates around, like, why do people choose or not choose to do something difficult? So what I think it's fitting as we start there. So what sparked your interest to explore whether difficulty signals importance or impossibility? Why'd you decide to tackle this?
Thank you for asking me. That's a super good question. And I would say rather than focusing first on difficulty, what I first focused on was uh, the motivational power of imagining a future self. And I started out by thinking about kids in school and how actually when you're in school, and then actually it's true for most of life, you're not really thinking about, do I want to do this right now? Is this for me right now? What you're really thinking about is, will future me be glad that current me did this right now? That's kind of school in a nutshell. Homework is never the most exciting thing that you could be doing. Your teacher is almost never the most exciting thing in the classroom. There are lots of other things that are more fun, more engaging, more immediately evocative. However, when students are not thinking about what's fun right now, what's drawing my attention right now, but rather, what can current me do to invest in the kinds of things that future me would like? How can current me help future me? What can current me do right now in terms of engaging that would make progress on the possible selves, the imagined futures, the specific identities that I would like to become, and to put more distance between my to be avoided possible selves, those specific identities that I don't want to become true of me. Then suddenly, magically, you can understand why people engage in actually potentially less positively valence, less pleasurable right now, less fun right now, less appetitive right now, all sorts of things, yet important. And then I thought, okay, but theories don't actually talk about that. They act as if simply imagining a future self would be enough, having a possible self would be enough. And that might explain why effects are either small or highly variable. You can find them, but it's not enough. So the first thing I started thinking about was, all right, so what might that missing link be? And the first thing I was thinking about, as I just finished saying, was actually strategies. Are you thinking about concrete strategies to link me now to future me? And that might be filling the gap. So a lot of the initial work that I did was thinking about, well, do you have what I started calling a plausible roadmap? It's not just I'm imagining future me and imagining it is enough, or I'm imagining the me I don't want to become and imagining that is enough. There has to be some sort of roadmap that would get me going, that would give me concrete, specific strategies. that might illuminate the pitfalls in the social context, things I need to focus on, things I need to avoid. So that was the initial work. And that got pretty far. But it wasn't really explaining everything. And there's a whole other literature that talks about, well, what you need for the future you to get going is simply to feel connected. That future me and current me should feel like the same me, which is technically true. You don't become actually a different person. You get older and more wrinkly, but you're the same person. And similarly, there's another literature that says, no, it's not about feeling connected. It's about noticing a gap. Because if current me and future me are the same me, there's no need to change my behavior. But a lot of the things that we do to get from current me to future me involves changing a behavior. And that was work at the time. Carver and Shire had a cybernetic model. And they said, what you want to do is imagine your future self, then notice the gap. There's always notice the gap, which is a contrasting kind of cognitive process. Notice the gap. Calculate in your mind how much velocity you need to move forward or to go away from it, calculating that, and then monitoring. And if you're going fast, good. If you're going faster than you expected, bonus, you can stop focusing on that so much and do something else. If you're going slower than you expected, engage more, or ask yourself, maybe this isn't for me. So that was one version of it, is you just need a possible self as a thing forward or as a thing to not to become. The next version of that was no, you need to think of them as connected, or else why invest in that stranger who's future you? And then the third one was saying, no, you need to think about it as a contrasting standard. So I thought, well, all three of those different models have some supporting evidence. So how could it be that things that seem to contradict one another all seem to work? And I thought, well, there's a missing moderator. There's something that people aren't thinking of, which is why sometimes this works, sometimes that works, and sometimes yet a third thing works. What would that missing moderator be? Well, what I noticed is all of that literature on the self, on motivation, on self-regulation, doesn't really address the metacognitive experience. What does it feel like when you're thinking? And in fact, the assumption is as if all of these things are easy. So I do it this way, or I do it that way, or I do it this way. And if it's easy, then any method will probably work. I imagine a possible self with strategies, I get going. I think about future me as the same me, and I invest in that one. I notice a gap and I go, I better get going. All of those seem plausible, but thinking often doesn't feel easy, particularly when you are imagining the future, which is unclear. You don't know for sure. It's uncertain. Uncertainty is related to an experience of disfluency or difficulty. Also, mentally simulating or actually getting going on those four things, as your opening example suggested, doesn't necessarily feel easy. And people don't have to draw inferences from how easy or difficult thinking feels, but they often do. So I thought to myself, well, if easy means possible, it's possible for me, what might difficulty mean? Well, it could mean that it's important, because the goals that are valuable aren't goals that everyone can easily attain. So it might be a signal of importance, but more commonly, at least within American culture, it might signal simply that the odds are low, increasing my sense of uncertainty and hence my propensity to shift to something else. So the first question I had is, well, let's see what's out there. And it turns out there really wasn't anything. So I thought, well, I need to first then see whether, thinking of when something feels difficult, do they draw an inference? Difficulty means importance. Do they draw an inference? Difficulty means impossibility. And I was thinking about them as two different resources, two different coins that you have in your pocket, rather than the flip sides of the same construct, the same coin. Why? Well, much like you started in the beginning, people may sometimes, or in some content domains, think, this is hard. I can really do this. I'll rev up the engagement because this is the real me. So if when it feels hard, I feel relatively certain that this is really central to me, important to who I am, I should rev up my effort and believe difficulty means importance and really ace that art project. At the same time, if when it feels difficult, I think to myself, who was I kidding? This isn't really me. It's a waste of my time. I should shift to something else. Then that third or fourth draft, as you've yet one more time drawn out of the lines or made a nose that looks like a foot, you say to yourself, okay, that's it. Who was I kidding? This art project is for the birds because I am not an artist. And so the same person could draw either inference and likely does draw different inferences depending on either features of the situation, like you alluded to at first, or at the moment, how certain or uncertain I am that this identity, an artist, an academic, is true for me, is the real me. And if I'm less certain, I might go for difficulty as impossibility more. If I feel more certain, for difficulty as importance more. If in the context it seems that the odds of success are very low, difficulty as impossibility may be more fluently on my mind. If in the context it seems ambiguous, it might work, then maybe difficulty as importance will be more likely to be on the mind. So the very first set of studies was really saying, can I create these measures? How do they function? How do they relate to other measures of self-regulation and motivation? Because the key issue that seemed to me to be a gap was that we weren't, as a field, thinking about the inferences people draw from difficulty. That difficulty isn't necessarily demotivating, it can be motivating.
This episode was made possible through a Psychi sponsorship with the Alliant International University, California School of Professional Psychology, at CSPP. Founded in 1969, CSPP was one of the nation's first independent schools of professional psychology. Today, CSPP continues its commitment to preparing the next generation of mental health professionals and advocates. Their dedication to ensuring every community's access to quality mental health care extends from integrated care to inclusive family therapy. Explore their programs at https://info.alliant.edu/partner-psychi. And yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes too.
So the first thing I did is came up with the ability to measure the things, documented this sort of discriminant validity, that they're correlated with other measures, but not highly, that they are distinct from each other in the sense that a person can be high in one, but that doesn't necessarily predict that they're high in the other or low in the other. So that across studies, correlations always include zero in the confidence interval, which means that knowing one doesn't give you predictive power of knowing the other. And the correlations aren't necessarily positive or negative. So it's not that, okay, it's not significant, but on average, people who believe in difficulty as importance don't believe in difficulty as impossibility, which would be a negative correlation. The confidence interval includes zero, and about equal number of times people believe both because it can be true and both of them can be true at the same time. However, in the moment for a specific behavior, one or the other is the thing that's on your mind. So when you do measurement studies, what's nice is it allows you to understand the complexity of people's reasoning because you measure both. And you can say controlling for the endorsement of one scale, does the other scale also have predictive? The answer is yes. Then the next thing you can do is to say, all right, I want to make one or the other accessible. How have I done that? Well, in some studies, I either asked you first to just read the scale and rate how much you agree or disagree, which brings one scale or the other scale to mind. And I showed that simply having the scale on your mind, separately from how much you agreed, influences behavior. Another version of that is to say, well, let me do an autobiographical recall task. So I asked you to remember a time when schoolwork was hard, but you thought to yourself, well, this is important for me. Or when it was hard and you thought to yourself, maybe I should shift to something else. And people can write about it. It's easy for them to think of it. And simply having written about it influences behavior in much the same way as endorsing the scale or simply having the scale on your mind works. And as a double check of the likelihood that what's on your mind is the difficulty mindset, we then measure, and in fact, you endorse the relevant difficulty mindset more once you've done that recall test. So that's kind of how we've measured things until now. And the reason, like I said, that I started thinking about what are the inferences people draw from difficulty is the quintessential example I was starting from is what's going on in the context of school. So it's a task or goal. It's an identity. So this schoolwork right now is the task or goal, but the identity is, am I a school kind of a person? Am I, as you said, is it just school in general, or is it this subject, or is it, uh, the kind of a career that I might have given this subject? There are a variety of different ways that you can think about those. But in each of those cases, I can legitimately ask myself a question: is this task or goal for me, or should I shift to something else? And the goal here, you could think of, goal, I'm putting air quotes around, uh, because it's a broad concept. And some people who talk about goals are really talking about possible like future identities. Will I become like this? Will I avoid this one that I don't want? Sometimes they use the word goal and they mean the teacher told you to do this. Are you working on it? So to me, that's kind of more task-like because you have a job to do. Um, so that got me a lot of interesting studies asking the questions that you started with, which is, okay, how trait or state-like are these? So to what extent does endorsing a difficulty as a possibility or importance mindset, to what extent is that an individual difference variable? So trait-like, people differ between themselves. And to what extent is that something that fluctuates over time or across days, kind of a state-like thing? Both should be true. So from the theory of identity-based motivation, which is a social psychological theory of self-regulation and goal pursuit, that says that people infer stability. They infer that they know who they are and that should predict what they want to do. But at the same time, identities are context sensitive in the sense that context tells you something about what are the possible identities that are relevant here. And given that, you ask yourself, do I have that identity? Could I have that identity? And the way you figure that out is you look at what's going on in the situation and you do a matching. So identity, though feeling stable, is both something that you carry into a situation and something that's constructed in the situation. Other theories have talked about that in terms of like a working self concept, which is a similar but not fully congruent idea. A working self concept is a way of thinking about the self or identity as a very large mental construct, not all of which can be brought to mind at any point in time. Only some of it is on your mind, which means that the context pulls from your memory some working subset that's relevant to the context. What's new here with identity-based motivation theory is what I'm arguing is that, yeah, some things come from memory, like in the working self-concept idea, but some things are literally constructed in the moment. I ask you, do you want to bungee jump? I don't know if I want to bungee jump. I've never bungee jumped. I'm not even quite sure what it looks like. So I have to make some decision. Is that the kind of person I am or not right now in the moment? I may find myself bungee jumping, though I would have predicted that I wouldn't, given the situation. Then apparently I'm a bungee jumper, right? So that's why I'm saying there's some dynamic construction element that then carries forward into new situations. So I suddenly created an identity. Maybe it gets then brought back into my working memory, which then ends up in long-term memory, so that in a new situation, potentially that could come up. So the first difference between other theories of self and motivation and identity-based motivation is this idea that it's not just a working memory, but it's also dynamic construction. The second difference is the one that we led with, which is inferences from difficulty. So my argument is that there's really three components to the way that the self works. One is the content of identity, The other is connected actions. And the third is the inferences we draw when thinking about those identities or engaging in the actions feel difficult or easy, but easy apparently uh, is the inference that all theories draw. So the unique element from difficulty mindsets for identity-based motivation is that if I cue the meaning from difficulty, I'll cue more certainty about identity, which will increase the likelihood of behavior. If I get you to do something, that'll cue something about what difficulty must mean, which will make you more certain about behavior. So it's a recursive process among the three. I'm going to give you a chance to ask other questions.
So I think you've very nicely wrapped in really, I think, good answers for the second and third questions here, defining and like what is identity based motivation and what are different contexts and how does that influence. Um, I'm thinking I'll just skip those and jump into the next, unless you had something you wanted to say for those.
Yeah, that's fine. I guess the other thing that I would want to link to is that work has been extremely productive, both in terms of just, fun and games in the lab, and also thinking then, all right, I started thinking about kids in school. Do I have something useful to offer school context? And there, what I thought to myself was, all right, um, it is kind of novel to think about difficulty as importance. But if I give a teacher a lesson plan and say, tell kids, when it's hard, it's important. Um, that sounds like the little engine that could, that children's story. I think I can, right? Um, and so one question then is it culturally fluent? Is it a thing that Americans think about a lot? Or potentially the fact that there's only one story we can think of means that it's not all that culturally fluent. Um, so I then said, well, before I decide if that's an American story or a general story, I should do some cross cultural comparisons. And there, what we did is we said, well, on average, by now, lots of studies document that people, when you just give them the scale, here are these items, how much do you agree or disagree? Um, the two scales are orthogonal, even when you ask the questions randomly interleaved so that it reduces the chance that you have two separate scales. It does produce two separate scales, so people seem to have two mental constructs in mind. But on average, people agree that difficulty means importance. Americans, middle school, college, adults, and disagree, so below the neutral midpoint of the scale, that difficulty means impossibility. So when I just ask you, you say, when a task or goal feels hard, I know in my gut it's important for me, agree. When a task or goal feels hard, I know in my gut it's just not for me, nah, slightly disagree or disagree. So there are, in terms of people's explicit statements, that's what it looks like. Well, what about if I were to get a less direct measure? So, in a series of studies, we did a number of things. One, we just gave people the dictionary definition of difficulty and all the synonyms we could find. And we just said, for each word that you're going to see on the screen, take a finger on the keyboard, and we gave you a one to press for that's more similar to importance, and a different finger to press, it's more similar to impossibility. And what we got with Americans is that on average, across those definitions and synonyms, people said it's more about impossibility. So even though when you gave them the scale, they said difficulty doesn't mean impossibility, when they thought about the words, it meant impossibility. We did the exact same thing with participants from India, for whom English is also first language or fluent language, and hence we could use the exact same materials. Indians didn't find difficulty to be mostly about impossibility. In fact, if anything, they slightly thought it was more about importance. Then we said, all right, maybe it's some weird picadillo of the English language. So we did the same project, but in China, using Chinese definitions and synonyms of difficulty. Chinese, of course, is a character-based language, and it's not only that in that sense a somewhat different, it's a different writing system, but characters carry with them the way you understand characters. You put them together, and it creates a meaning, and that meaning you infer the word. So it's more, in some ways more alliterative. So an example of a synonym for difficulty is you pull down your cuff, you pull down your sleeve of your jacket, as it were, to hide the frayed cuff, only to expose a hole in your elbow. Okay, so some of the right, so sometimes the phrases were more flowery than in English, which allows you to say, all right, in a completely different language, with a completely different writing system, am I seeing the same patterns, or is this culturally limited to Americans? Because we already got a difference between Indians and Americans using English. What about Chinese using the Chinese language? There are more synonyms in Chinese, so to make the burden the same, we did random subsampling so that we got all of the words, but we kept the number of items that you were rating the same across the languages. And in China, we do not find that preference for difficulties and possibility. We find that people are basically agnostic. It could mean either thing equally. And what that implies is that in the US in particular, compared to these other uh, industrialized, high educated, certainly competing positively in terms of academic rankings with American children, difficulty doesn't necessarily carry with it the connotation of impossibility. We did a bunch of follow-up studies. We looked at secondary data analysis. There's a nice data set somebody has done looking at synonyms. You free associate words and come up with synonyms. We did a spatial analysis there. And in the English language, again, there's more overlap between difficulties and possibility in the free association network than with importance. We did an IAT, which basically answers the question, is it top of mind? And for Americans, again, more top of mind to link difficulty with impossibility than with importance. So in spite of people's explicit ranking, impossibility is more on mind. What does that mean for an intervention at school? That means that kids are well practiced with difficulties and possibility. No need to practice that one. What we need then is tasks or activities that give you an aha moment. When something is hard for me, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible, that the odds are low, that I should just quit and shift to something else. It could mean that it's valuable, it's worth my while. Now notice the construct is different from related motivational constructs. So one related motivational construct you might think of is, oh, it's just persistence, just like a conscientiousness thing. When I start, I should finish, which is really what the construct of grit is getting at. But grit says when I start, I should finish. It doesn't explicitly engage with what does it mean when it's hard for me. Another potential related construct is efficacy, right? I am or could be competent. And again, I am or could be competent. Underneath that maybe is that people can change, which is a growth mindset idea, because that's how I could be competent if I'm not competent now. But it doesn't tell me that life might be hard and what that difficulty might mean. So all of these constructs, we measured how much you endorse them, and is it correlated with difficulties, importance, and impossibility? And actually, there's a small to moderate negative correlation with many of these, and difficulties and possibility. But the correlation with difficulty is importance. The less top of mind, the less culturally fluent uh, frame for Americans is lower and not necessarily significant. So that seems to be really quite a unique construct, similarly with growth mindset, which is not saying what inference should I draw from difficulty. It's saying, sort of like efficacy, if I try, if I engage, then I can change. But it's not talking about difficulty. So it is adding both empirically given the measurement things or doing regressions and throwing the constructs in. And also theoretically, just asking what is the construct meant to address? It is a unique construct. Okay. So what would we do in school? That's been a project that the initial studies were published in 2002. So we'll just round up and call it a quarter of a century. So I used to be young and then I started working in schools. But that really, the first publication in 2002 was asking the question, can we do activities with kids in school in their regular classroom that's fun and engaging, and that kids then have these aha moments of the core ideas of difficulty mindsets, but identity-based motivation more generally. I can imagine a future, so I have a stake. It's connected to me right now through what it is I'm trying to become in the coming year with strategies I'm doing right now in school. When it's hard, that's okay. Often things are hard. That doesn't necessarily mean I should just quit. It means I have to think about ways around obstacles. I may not get the exact thing I was focusing on, but there's some essence that I'm trying to get to. So I may not become a pilot because I'm too short and my eyes are weak. But why was I trying to become a pilot? Maybe I wanted to see the world. Maybe I, wanted to serve my country. So what is the thing I'm trying to get to? So there's a way around the obstacle of the specific goal because it's the future. It can't be known for sure. That's part of why it's hard, but I can get around it and keep going. That set of activities was published, took a while. teen uh, Oxford University Press book that gives the theory and the manual and how do you code for fidelity so you know that you're doing what you're supposed to do, how do you measure, all that is out there. In the meantime, I had run follow-up randomized trials. Those were initially in the city of Detroit because I was at the University of Michigan, so that was the closest large city. But then I wanted to expand to make sure that the results are stable, that they work not just in one city, but more generally. Um, why pick cities? You need a large sample size. Rural is, by definition, small, which means you would need lots of money to study. So the first expansion was to say, well, can we do this in the next city next door, which was Chicago? Um, and so this together with Dick Sorensen, a former student, we then said, not only should we be asking, can we get stable effects, but if we want these to be policy relevant, it can't be that a researcher or some community members who were trained to run the intervention or college students, which were all the things we had done before, come and do it. For something to be policy relevant, it has to be something that's institutionalizable, which means that teachers have to be able to be trained to do it and to train other teachers so that it doesn't need an outside thing. It can be a teacher-led, teacher-trained process. And we documented that we can train teachers to actually deliver these activities, that when you do it well, kids actually do change their identity-based motivation. That's the mediator to changing their grades trajectory such that controlling for the past 2 years, you get effects the end of the year, at the end of the next year. That was lovely. Then we said, I don't want to just do cities. I really would like to do rural areas. So we have just completed working with the state of Nevada. This is funded by the Department of Education, which includes both urban and rural areas. And then we wanted to be powered to answer the questions if you're a principal in a rural school. You don't want to just know on average, including rural schools. You'd like to know I have a big enough sample to really answer the question for rural schools. Well, the whole state of Nevada wasn't quite big enough to have statistical sort of power to feel that it was a stable effect if you used only the rural schools. So we included also schools in rural Colorado that had similar characteristics so that we have enough rural schools to actually answer the question. And we just finished that um, data collection process in 2024 and have just started publishing the papers related to the larger question that you start out by asking at the child level, what are context effects that might influence what I believe? But then if you're thinking about this as a policy question, we want to ask the larger question, what are context effects that may make it easier or harder for teachers to deliver with fidelity, for kids to get the active ingredients? And so we've been looking at what might be going on there. And what we've discovered so far is that across a decade of teacher delivery of pathways, year after year after year, different teachers in the first time delivery, trained by different trainers in different contexts, in terms of the geography, in terms of the school climate, teachers can still attain the fidelity that's necessary to deliver the program well. So that means that we're able to think of something that's straightforward and simple enough to actually not just be a great theory, but actually be robust at a policy level. And the next question is, that's great. Are there differences? There are slight differences. It seems that urban areas have are a context where it's easier for teachers to deliver with fidelity. And what we're trying to unpack, it's not that teachers in rural areas on average aren't delivering with fidelity. It's just that the rural areas are significantly, though slightly lower in their fidelity. And then what we want to understand is, what are the channel factors? What makes it harder in a rural area? Because about 20% of American children are actually going to school in rural areas. So we can't just say it also works for you. We want to think about, well, what are the things that might make it easier for teachers in rural schools that are doable? And so that's sort of one of the things that we're thinking about in terms of future projects, which was a question you asked me 40 minutes ago. What are the kinds of things that would be helpful to make it easier for teachers in rural areas to actually engage with this project in ways that bolster the fidelity? Because we know that they're able to hit the required level, but we also know that higher fidelity is good for making those changes in kids' identity-based motivation. So that's one sort of future direction. The other future direction that I alluded to in the beginning, we were focusing on how people draw inferences from tasks and goals. And then we started thinking, you know, sometimes it's not a task or a goal that you can choose to invest in or leave. Sometimes life is hard. It just is. You can't say, I choose not to be in a pandemic, or I choose not to have a mother who has cancer. You can't make those choices. They just are. So whether that's in your personal life that there are difficulties, or that in the society that you're living in, or in the world that you're living in, life is hard. So we went back and looked to see, well, what does the literature say about this? We thought there has to be some literature on this. And the cultural sort of basis, the anchor that we had, was we looked to see, well, um, religions, spiritual worldviews, political worldviews, particularly conservatism, give us some sense that suffering can have meaning, that suffering can build character, that if you're a religious person, that it's not for naught because it brings you closer to God. And religions often practice suffering. So there's fasting, there's other rituals of giving up foods at certain times. There's things you're not allowed to do that wouldn't harm anyone. You just can't do them. And we thought, well, why are people doing that as part of religious faith? Well, if in fact life is hard and the harshness seems unfair, why do your children die? Why is your mother sick? Why are people hungry? You need reasons for that because you can't change it. You just have to live with it. And we thought, all right, what is that in terms of a difficulty mindset that would relate to identity-based motivation? So we started calling that difficulty as sanctifying, but the secular version is difficulty as improvement. And it's saying not that I choose a task or goal to invest in or to shift away from, but rather when life is hard, is enduring itself going to build my character, going to make me a better person? And if I believe that, how does that carry over to my preference for the means for goal attainment. So do I prefer a more effortful means as a carryover from just believing in general that suffering can be good for you? And there we've documented both in the school context and other situations that when people endorse difficulty as improvement more, they prefer the harder way to do things. They believe it's going to be more effective. They think it'll work for them. So the other stuff just doesn't smell right. Like, how are you going to get good grades? Right? Are you going to take the easier classes? Are you going to cram for at the last minute? These could work. If the goal is to get good grades, these could work. But people who believe more in difficulties improvement don't think that those don't, they seem almost like cheating. You really should be working really hard. You should have a schedule. You should get up in the morning. You should be underlining all your things. You should be reviewing those notes, right? So they're thinking of the effortful ways as the right way to do it. And we found the same thing when we asked people about their fitness goals. We gave them a variety of methods, or we asked them about their weight maintenance goals, and we gave them a variety of methods. People who endorse difficulties improvement more prefer ways that they subjectively rate as harder, which if you had an efficiency goal, just get to my, right, just get to the outcome I want, that wouldn't make any sense. So that's the other thing that we've been working on, is to understand how difficulty as improvement works. Potentially it came from religious roots, but you don't need to be religious to believe it. And what happens both in your daily life and over time. And here too, we've looked at cross-cultural differences, and we found that people in less wealthy countries, more conservative, sort of from religious or political backgrounds, um, tend to endorse, to whether the country or at the individual level, tend to endorse difficulties improvement more. But we've also found that on days in which you endorse difficulties improvement more with diary studies, you find more purpose and meaning in life. You are more likely to engage in the effortful way to attain your goals. And you believe that you were more successful on any given day. So it seems to be satisfying. So that's the other line of research that we're continuing to explore.
Well, so I had a question about cross cultural comparisons. I had a question about academic effects and whether or not you could actually shift difficulty mindsets, and a question about what's next. And you have eloquently addressed all of these points. I love it personally. I think it's amazing. I've had a great time, and I'm going to go ahead and declare it. I think it's official. I'm 100% sure that this has been from a host perspective, the easiest podcast on difficulty ever recorded in all of history. I mean, I'm sure of that. Um, so let's see. I guess one of the things I'm wondering, let's say hypothetically, because I would never do this, but let's say I have some projects sitting on my desk and I haven't touched them, which again, I'd never do, wink, wink, wink. Would, looking at those projects and could I convince myself that these are appropriate to my identity in order to make myself more likely to do so? Do you think I can do that to make myself get started on something I don't want to?
So I think you're hitting on a real, like, it's the human condition. And what I mean by that is, the more something is actually central to your identity, the more you actually care about it, the harder it is to get going, because difficult is going to be hard. Any project is hard. And I'm assuming we're talking about writing projects.
Uh-huh.
And writing starts from, I know exactly what I'm trying to say in your head, to some weird, clunky, useless sentence that you write on the page. That's how writing starts. It always starts that way. And then you think, wait a minute, do I not know what I'm talking about at all? Who is I to think I have any expertise in this domain? It's very unlikely that anyone will care what I have to say, because it's obvious. Look at this yucky, barely grammatical, not particularly deep sentence I've just written at some high level of abstraction. That's what writing looks like. It doesn't bother you very much when there's the thing that's in your head isn't all that valuable to you. it bothers you a lot when the idea, the thing that you want to get going on matters to you a lot. And so I think you're right, your insight that this is about difficulty and it's about a very sort of compelling feeling that it couldn't possibly be the real you if it's so hard. I think that you've hit really on the essence of why identity-based motivation theory, had I not come up with it, somebody would have had to, because that's really the problem. And I agree with you. Say to yourself, of course it's difficult, because if it was an easy project, 9 other people would have already written it up. So it's not just that I think this is really important for me, this is my unique contribution, but also it apparently is hard because somebody else hasn't already done it. So I better get going. Whatever I manage to do, the progress I manage to make will be better than doing nothing. And tomorrow's another day. I'll try again. So what do we know from the diary studies? On days in which you endorse difficulty as importance more, you have more self-compassion. And what is self-compassion? At the end of the day, you say to yourself, Bradley, I did the best I could. Not perfect. Tomorrow's another day. I'll try again. On the days in which you endorse difficulty as impossibility more than your average, you're particularly low in self-compassion. Who is I kidding? What an idiot. Why did I even think I could do this? Not for me, you grumpily say as you go to bed, because diary studies are done right before you go to bed. Here's the sad part. Difficulty as impossibility has basically a double-sized kick in the pants in terms of the effect size, as difficulty as importance has an elevating thing. So we, at least as Americans, are really well practiced in telling ourselves, shift to something else, don't do it. And it's harder for us to keep that other piece going. But remember that when you are engaged with a difficulty as importance frame, it allows you to make progress. And of course, progress is uncertain. It's way easier to just shift to something else. So that would be, to me, that's the human condition. That's why we need the theory, to actually be able to have some self-compassion for ourselves and others, because actually continuing to engage in things that feel disfluent until it actually starts to get better. And we know a writing project is done when we read it and go in one setting, rather than read the first paragraph and go, oh God, what was I trying to say, right? So it feels disfluent, it feels difficult for many, many, many rounds.
I guess my first instinct is when I think about this topic, is I'm thinking, how do I get myself to not see things as impossible and take on more? And maybe that's not even healthy, right? I mean, at
No,
some point
it's
you
not
can't take
healthy.
on everything.
You can't take on everything, and you can't take on everything. And the reason I went to great lengths to make sure that these are really two separate constructs, not flip sides of the same, is a lot of times we think of constructs, particularly Americans, we like simple things. We like to say, up is good, down is bad. Self-esteem is good, low self-esteem is bad, efficacy is good, low efficacy is bad. But for difficulty mindsets, these are really two resources. Sometimes it's better to stop persisting and shift to something else. Other times, you can't know if you'll succeed because you haven't invested enough yet. And then difficulty as importance is useful. But it's neither the case that it's always good to keep persisting, nor the case that it's always good to keep shifting. We need both. So I would definitely not want anybody to walk away from this podcast thinking, well, I just learned that difficulty's importance is good and difficulty's impossibility is bad, because it's very much context dependent. And for certain tasks and goals, like being in school, it's really important to practice up pulling out as your first idea, maybe this is important for me. Not that you'll never think I should shift to something else, but if you don't invest enough, you'll never know.
Well, this has been really just wonderful. Yeah, I imagine there's a lot of people out there, they're stock trading or whatever, and they're $20,000 in the hole. They've been doing this forever, and they got some guru telling them, yeah, but you're so close. There's a gym. Just if you dig the mine tunnel a little further, you're almost to it. And so the ability to stop is certainly just as valuable as the one to start sometimes. How good or bad do you think people are at this? Like, there's some things that are just simply impossible. Like, are some people better at determining what's impossible than others, or are we okay at this?
That's a super great question. And that really is a question not about the moment, but about time. Over time, do you notice that circumstances have changed? That what an investment that used to be good for you is no longer in your best interest and that you should shift to something else? I can't as yet say confidently that I know the answer to that question. What we are doing right now is we have shifted our own research from looking only at investment kinds of things. So situations where there's a task or goal and that you should go with your first foot forward. Okay, let me engage. And there we know with certainty that if difficulties importance is on your mind, you engage more, you perform better, you feel better about your own likelihood of attaining your goals. Then we said, all right, let's think about those other situations. You're the day trader and you're losing money. The classic descriptions within economics are this idea of a sunk cost fallacy, which is I've put in so much, exactly as you said, right? I can't stop now. I've already spent so much. And the other version of this, which is related, is called an escalation of commitment. So that you basically you're throwing good money after bad. Um, the classic version of this is you've invested uh, your research budget, you're trying to make a product, then a competitor comes out with a better and cheaper product. Do you quit your investment because you don't yet have a product at all, or do you finish your product? And what we found, whether it's sunk cost kinds of scenarios where, you bought tickets and the weather's terrible and it's too late to try and sell your tickets, do you risk your life on the roads and go anyway? Or do you just say, well, the money's been spent. I don't need also to risk my life and not go. And what we find across these various different kinds of scenarios is that people who are in the moment in a difficulty as importance mindset say yes, and they do these things that they shouldn't do. And people who are in a difficulties and possibility mindset say no. And when we follow up and ask them and give them these sort of obvious things, well, I have to go because I spent the money, or I already spent the money. I don't need to risk my life. The difficulties importance people pick A. And you would think as we wrote it, we're like, oh, it'll be so obvious to people. They'll go, "Oh, never mind, I've changed my mind." No, they say they go for it. Whereas the difference in possibility people say, "No, I'm not gonna do it because the money's already gone. I can't get it back. I don't need to risk my life now also." So there does seem to be, in that sense, it's effective in noticing that you should quit. The other literature on this has been called, the pain of letting go. And that's within the developmental literature. And there, the question is, and this was studied. One of the researchers is Roche. Um, the issue there is, as your life unfolds in terms of a developmental timeline, there are certain goals that become unattainable simply with time. So when you're 47, you will not be a child prodigy. Period. So that goal is not attainable anymore because child is no longer describing you. Or, even with advanced technologies, at a certain age, if you haven't had children, you won't have children. So there's certain goals that they've studied in from a developmental perspective that basically become unattainable with time. And the question is, do people continue to persist in imagining that as a future self? And how hard is it to let go of that goal? And I gave two very extreme examples, but you can think of similar things. People who repeatedly try to, break into a profession or attain a degree, and you're in your 12th year in the PhD program. Um, is this really a good investment of your time? Is this PhD going to produce the things that you had hoped for when you were 22? So there are those kinds of things that people have to. It's very painful to let go of a goal because I had imagined it something I was looking at every day. When I looked at myself in the mirror as I'm brushing my teeth, I saw future me. And suddenly all I see is funny me with the toothbrush. There's nothing there. So it makes sense that it's painful to let go of goals. So there's a measure of that. And sure enough, when difficulties and importance is on the mind, letting go of goals is more painful than when difficulties and possibilities is on the mind. What I don't know, because I haven't tracked people over time, real time, the diary studies. So I can't say in real time, um, are there, what are the signatures of people who flexibly, can shift from one mindset to another? But clearly, that's what the theory would predict. They're orthogonal for a reason. Situations should cue one or the other. And the best sort of, most flexible personality would be the kind that would allow you to reassess situations and ask yourself, is this still in my interest?
I just want to thank you so much for really just running the entire show today. And I just wanted to say that you've made a very difficult subject extremely enjoyable. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Wasn't that great? You've just listened to another episode of Psych Everywhere, a podcast by PsyChi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. For this show, distinguished guests weigh in on applying psychological science to a diverse range of current events and to better your life. Listen for free wherever you go for podcasts, or see a written transcript on YouTube. If you haven't already subscribed to Psych Everywhere, go ahead and follow us wherever you go for podcasts. Tell a friend or colleague about the show. Word of mouth is a huge help. So share what you learned at the dinner table or in your classes. You could also follow us on X at PsyChi Podcast and leave a review at Apple Podcasts. You'll absolutely make my day. And more importantly, you'll be helping us get Psych everywhere. Copyright 2025, PsyChi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.